We're not talking about actors. We mean a real monster.
I brought her back. She'll live and I'll get her another body.
I know they're gonna kiss me, but don't let anyone see me like that. Please, Doctor, help me!
Biologically speaking, it's of primary importance that man should want to mate. Hey, that's...
You don't get all your kicks from surfing, do you?
We want to be free to ride our machines without being hassled by the man. And we want to get loaded.
You think you're gonna make a slave of the world? I'll see you in hell first!
The American International Podcast.
Are you ready?
Attention, and welcome to the American International Podcast. I'm Cheryl Lightfoot.
And I'm Jeff Markin.
And today we're talking about Hell Squad from 1958.
Hell Squad was written, directed, and produced by Burt Topper for Rhonda Productions.
It stars Wally Campo as Private Russo, Brandon Carroll as Lieutenant Max Schlechter, Fred Gavlin as Sergeant Clemens, Gregg Stewart as Private Nelson, Leon Schrier as Private Roth, Cecil Addis as Private Lippy, Jack B. Sowards as German soldier in American uniform, Don Chambers as USHQ Captain, Larry Shuttleworth as Sergeant Collins, Ben Bigelow as HQ Radioman Calvin, and Gordon Edwards as Rescue Radioman Private Manson.
The movie starts with, I believe, a soldier standing guard. He's jumped from behind. It's really hard to tell what's going on. This scene is very, very dark. There's some machine gun fire, and then it goes right into the title, Hell Squad. And we have a montage of burning warships and...
Something explodes. We see something explode wherever we are. There seems to be some kind of fire going on.
This goes throughout the credits. And when the credits end, we can now see what's going on. It's morning. And what we see is soldiers walking around the desert. A title comes up saying, the foot soldiers know only the battles fought on the ground they walk.
These soldiers seem to be heading away from that conflagration. And there's a lot of shooting and bombing going on in the background. We don't really see what's happening. It's just sound effects, basically. And we're going to focus on one particular group of soldiers for this film.
There are 6 soldiers in this group, and they scatter as a plane flies overhead.
It strafes them from the air, and one of them is killed right away. That's Private Slade, and all we know is that he will blink once for "Are you dead?"
Sergeant Clemens goes to him and declares him dead, despite the private's blinking and breathing.
And he closes his eyes so we don't have to see any more of that.
And that's just so he won't blink anymore.
Right.
And then the men continue walking on the ground they walk.
Private Lippy starts to play his harmonica. Understandably, one of the men asks him to stop.
He doesn't really play as he kind of just breathes through it and makes noise.
Sometime later, we're still walking this uncharted desert. Lippy is still wheezing out a melody on the harmonica, and then a title comes up. Somewhere in Tunisia, June 12th, 1943, 0700 hours.
This is when they receive a call from C Company. Sergeant Clemens asks if they can give him his coordinates and if they could get a search plane. He says that he's lost 4 men yesterday, plus another one this morning.
The radio man, Calvin, asks if he can see a certain checkpoint from where he is, but he can't see it.
Sergeant Clemens asks again for a plane, and radio man Calvin relates this to the U.S. headquarters captain, and the captain reminds them that he told them no yesterday. And then he explains his reasons why to Sergeant Collins, also of C Company.
The captain explains that Lieutenant Treacher, who was the commanding officer of the lost men, had the section map with him, but he ended up being captured by the Germans. Sergeant Collins thinks on that for a second, and then Clemens radios in and says that they need an answer. Radioman Calvin whines at him to take it easy. Sergeant Collins asks about any other maps, but the captain says that that's the only one. Collins declares that it's a one-way ticket.
The captain points on his map where he believes that Clemens and his men are, and he tells Sergeant Collins to take 3 men and see if they can pick them up. Then he again tells Radioman Calvin to tell Clemens that he said there will be no planes. Calvin tells Clemens over the radio to hold their position until they can come and get them.
And through a mouthful of tobacco juice, Calvin relays the message.
Clemens starts to reply, but he realizes that the signal is dead.
Private Russo cackles that he's acting like an angry girlfriend. Calvin announces that they cut him off, and the captain tells Collins to have his men do a big circle around their search area and turn inwards.
So now we're back in the desert with the lost squad, and Privates Russo and Nelson are talking. As Russo pulls on his canteen and drinks, Nelson, hearing a plane in the distance, asks if he thinks they sent a plane out for them. Russo doesn't think so. He said it shouldn't be taking this long for them to find them, and that it's probably a bomber going back to reload. He hands his water to Nelson, and Nelson mentions that this was Slade's first time out, and they probably should have buried him.
Russo doesn't engage with that. As they share that canteen, Russo says that they're really dumb. After 2 days of wandering around, they can't even find their own lines. Nelson hopes that Treacher ditched the map before the Germans got him, but Russo thinks that at least somebody should find their lines, and it won't be them.
This whole time, Lippy has been playing his harmonica again, or breathing through it again, and Russo asks him if he knows any other tunes. Nelson says that Lippy never talks, and Russo says that's why they call him Lippy.
The intentional irony of the name is pointed out.
Russo pulls out the last part of a cigar and puts it in his mouth, and he asks Nelson if he has a match. And Nelson tells him he's already given him his last one. So the Hell Squad carries on forward. On the ground they walk.
Stop saying that. Clemens barks at them to get moving, and Russo says that now that Clemens is a sergeant standing in for their missing lieutenant, he thinks he's Napoleon, and he puts his hand inside his uniform shirt just to prove his point.
And again, the Hell Squad carries on forward. On the ground they walk.
However, in the next scene, Clemens calls for a break, and Lippy starts playing his harmonica again. Private Nelson rips a page out of a magazine. He goes behind the ridge and starts digging a hole, so I think we know what's going on there.
Russo picks up the magazine that Nelson left behind and flips to the centerfold and yells out, "Where's the other half?" Nelson says, "Other half of what?" And Russo says, "Never mind, you wouldn't dig it anyway."
Nelson took the good parts with him to use as toilet paper. And then Lippy has a flashback. He's with his unit. This is before any of the current day's action happened. They're getting ready for a charge. His brother is with him. He's playing Oh Susanna on that harmonica.
He's a much better harmonica player than Lippy is.
Well, he probably had lessons. Now where they are is on a beach. They're getting ready to storm it. They come up from the surf onto the sand and immediately get fired upon. Lippy falls next to his brother, but his brother is dead.
Back in their present, Sergeant Clemens explains to Private Roth that Lippy will be going home if they ever get out of this, and that he's the last of 3 brothers.
And that's the reason why Lippy doesn't talk.
Clemens tells Roth that Lippy took the harmonica from his dead brother's body and hasn't spoken since. Roth asks what happened to the first brother, and Clemens tells him not to ask.
If they get back, he'll get to go home, says Sergeant Clemens, jinxing him.
So the Hell Squad carries on forward. On the ground they walk. But it's not long before it's time for another break. Russo asks Clemens if he has a match, and Clemens tells him he's already given him his last one. And then Roth and Sergeant Clemens start discussing the situation. Roth asks if he's sure that Treacher was the only one that had been taken alive, and why was there only one map, and why didn't they send a plane? He thinks they were never intended to get back. Sergeant Clemens tells him to shut up, and that every time he thinks he gets dumber.
Now there's more walking. Clemens wants to head east so they can meet up with the rear guard of their fellow soldiers.
Nelson asks how much longer they'll be wandering around, and Sergeant Clemens lights a cigarette as he answers. Russo notices this and says, "Did you see that? That bum had matches." Just then, a fighter plane flies overhead, and the men hit the dirt.
But this only serves to make them easier targets. They get shot at, and then we go into the plane where we hear the German officer flying the plane, radioing back to his HQ, presumably giving him the location of the stragglers.
Back on the ground, Roth says it looks like the plane came back, and Sergeant Clemens sarcastically agrees. Roth asks if he thinks the plane is going home now, and Sergeant Clemens says probably, but regardless, they should get out of there before it changes its mind.
Clemens yells at the men to get going, but when Russo and Nelson get up, they see that Lippy cannot. They go to him, but it's too late. Clemens tells Russo and Nelson to grab Lippy's dog tags. Nelson and Russo do this. They sadly pull them off, and they take his canteen. Then they find his harmonica. Ultimately, they decide to leave it with him, and they lay it in his outstretched hand.
As they continue on, Roth asks Clemens why he never gets to talk on the radio, because I guess Radioman is his position. And what does Clemens even need him for? And Clemens says he needs him to carry it. So the Hell Squad carries on forward. On the ground they walk.
It's not long before they come across some dead bodies. They're tied up. They're not wearing their uniforms. Their hands are tied behind their back. The men go to investigate, but they take care, just in case the bodies are booby-trapped, not to touch anything. Russo looks down at one of the men and notices that he's wearing GI dog tags. He wants to look at them, but Clemens is still afraid that it might be a booby trap, so tells him no.
Nelson had been hanging back to keep guard, and Clemens instructs him to scout around.
Roth asks why their uniforms were stripped off them, but Clemens tells him to use his head. They're behind their own lines. The Germans are going to disguise themselves as GIs to keep from getting killed by anyone they come across.
Russo wants to go after Nelson because Nelson doesn't know that these bodies were American GIs and that there are possibly Germans wearing their uniforms, but Clemens commands him to stay where he is.
And Russo says nothing better happened to Nelson. Then we go with Nelson. He's wandering through the scrub. Back with the other men, Roth can't stop thinking about the horrors they must have gone through before they were shot. And Clemens tells him to quit bugging him. Russo doesn't want to stay in this spot, but Clemens reminds him that they need to be where Nelson thinks he left them.
If they move, he may not be able to find them. Now we find ourselves with a group of men in ill-fitting USGI uniforms speaking German amongst themselves. Nelson comes up from over the hill and yells down to them, "Hey, where'd you guys come from?"
Nelson goes down to greet them, and one of the soldiers speaks unaccented English, so he plays it up. He says they're battalion recon and wonders why Nelson is up there alone. Nelson tells this soldier everything that we know about what happened in the movie so far. The German lieutenant tells him to get the rest of his men and bring them over to where they are.
Before Nelson leaves, he turns back and asks the lieutenant if he has any matches, and the lieutenant obliges, hands him a book of matches, and Nelson runs off to tell the rest of the Hell Squad the good news.
Once gone, the lieutenant gives his men orders in German, so we don't know what he's saying.
Then the German soldiers have a good laugh at the expense of the stupid American soldier.
Nelson goes back to his unit to tell him the good news. Clemens is trying to figure out if these were those Germans that stole the American uniforms, by asking how many of them were there. It was 5 men, so Nelson figures out that he was talking to the enemy, and he's sickened to the point of throwing up.
Sergeant Clemens is ready to move on, but Russo tells him to give Nelson a minute to recover. Clemens tells him to tell it to the Germans when they come looking for him, and the German soldiers are still waiting for the stupid Americans to show up. The lieutenant sends one of his men up on the ridge to see what's taking them so long. The Hell Squad is nearby. Nelson points to where he had seen the Germans, just on the other side of that ridge, in what appears to be a riverbed. Russo sees that someone is on the ridge right now, and that someone waves to them.
Clemens plays along with this and says that they'll come after a rest. They're bushed. Then the German runs off back to his men. When he's out of earshot, Clemens says that they will go down to their ridge and come up behind them. When the German gets back to his unit, he tells them that their plan is working. However, it isn't. Once he's out of earshot, Clemens says that they're going to go down their ridge and come up behind them.
Before they go, Nelson asks Russo if he can have his first aid pack. Russo hands it to him, asking what happened to Nelson's, and Nelson reminded him that he used it on Russo's leg.
Now the Hell Squad is in a position where they can hear the Germans, but can't be seen. They're behind a huge boulder. The Germans are radioing into their headquarters. It's nearby, so they say. Russo wants to toss a grenade in the middle of them, but Clemens nixes it.
Clemens has them crawl past the Germans one at a time so they can sneak into position behind them. This works because Germans have no peripheral vision.
They're also gleefully mocking the American soldiers who are so stupid. And they're looking in the wrong direction. They're looking in the direction they think that they're going to come from.
So the Germans are still looking up at the ridge, waiting for the Americans, as Russo and Nelson take their positions. Russo likes this. The Germans are easy pickings, just like shooting whiskey bottles, but Nelson isn't comfortable shooting anyone in the back.
It's not sporting. And the Germans start to wonder what's taking them so long. But by now, the 4 Americans are on the top of a ridge, looking down on the Germans. They all open fire except Nelson.
The German radio man goes down. Russo throws a grenade, and then the foursome charges at the Germans. And they're all taken down.
They render aid to one of the wounded Germans, but he dies after drinking some of their dwindling water supply. However, one of the Germans has gotten away from them.
He flees and wedges himself into a crevice. Nelson comes up and covers them from above, and the German doesn't see him because Germans don't have peripheral vision. Clemens yells for him to come out, and the German soldier asks what for, to be shot? And then he lights a map on fire and burns it. Sergeant Clemens calls for him to throw out his weapon and they'll take him prisoner. And the German laughs, telling him that he's burned the only map telling them of their position.
Then Clemens yells at Nelson to fire. Instead of just firing, though, Nelson tells the German to look at him. Luckily, Russo has gotten to a point where he could shoot the German because Nelson doesn't, and this makes him very happy.
Yeah, Russo has no problem whatsoever shooting a man in the back and lets the German have it.
Nelson's a little shaken because he had to look him in the eye. Roth says that maybe they should bury this guy because he might be an officer. Russo gleefully buries him by tossing a grenade into the crevice where he was waiting to shoot at them. Even Clemens is a little disgusted by this, but Russo isn't sorry at all.
Then Nelson goes to Russo and asks why he hadn't been able to shoot that German. And Russo tells him not to worry about it. It happens to the best of them. And Nelson says that the German should have just given up. And Russo says that The guy had guts. If it had been him, he would have thrown in the towel.
And now they're walking again. Russo thinks that every hill looks the same and that they should give the place to the Germans. They don't want it.
And Clemens tells him to quit daydreaming and keep moving.
Then a call comes through on the radio. It's a British soldier. He's calling Company C. He's going to give them the locations of their lines when he has a positive position. But Clemens tells them to keep going. On the ground they walk.
Russo pulls out his cigar stub, and Nelson says, "That's right, I almost forgot," and hands him the book of matches that the German soldier had given him. But there's only one match in it.
And it goes out before Russo can light his stogie. The British officer calls again. He has that position. And then we cut to where he is. The Brit is calling from, oh no, he's with the Germans. He speaks both German and Limey.
And he's sitting in a foxhole about 20 feet away from the squad.
Everything's right there. He signals his men to get into position. He tells the Hell Squad that they have established their position, and Clemens tells them the gist of what they've done today. Basically everything that we've just told you.
Then a gunner pops up out of the foxhole and opens fire on them. Clemens, Roth, and Nelson are down. Russo crawls over to Nelson to give him some water, and Nelson reaches up and grabs Russo's face as he dies.
The Germans open fire again as Russo scrambles for cover, after taking the canteen, of course. There's only the one, and he needs the water. Russo thinks all is lost, but then he sees a squadron of planes flying overhead. But we don't know who they're with. The Germans are the Americans, British, we don't know.
Now there's a game of cat and mouse as Russo is being pursued on foot by a German with a bayonet. Russo gets the jump on him and stabs the German. Then Russo throws another grenade into the foxhole. Going back to check his handiwork, he finds a book of matches with a swastika on it. But this one's full, so he doesn't care. He also pulls up a map that's lying there, and he heads off.
As Russo staggers off, he realizes, only too late, that he is in a minefield. He tries to slowly back away, but he ends up setting off a mine. The German/British soldier that we thought was dead was merely resting. He crawls up the side of his foxhole and sees Russo trying to tend his leg wound. He was shot, as well as being very near an exploding mine.
Russo picks up his rifle when he sees the German approaching, and the German soldier says, "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Turns out he has the map revealing the location of the mines, and Russo is sitting in the middle of the minefield.
The man introduces himself as Max Schlechter. Russo briefly wonders why he's English and how he knew their position. And then he realizes it was the pilot that they saw earlier in the plane who reported their location to German headquarters.
Schlechter says that he had been monitoring their radio transmissions, and if it weren't for that, they'd never know of their positions.
And also, it's not a fake English accent. He defected to the German side.
Russo pulls out the map he had taken from the foxhole and places it on the ground in front of him. He says, "I see you make the same mistakes we do, marking all your positions." He then folds it back up and tucks it back into his jacket.
Schlechter looks mildly alarmed at this. And Russo asks, now what?
Schlechter sees they each have something the other wants. Maybe they could arrange a trade. Russo tells him to throw over the minefield map first, but Schlechter says that wouldn't be a very smart move since Russo was the one with the rifle. So Russo throws over his map, and Schlechter laughs, "You Americans." So Russo shoots Schlechter in the arm and demands that he throw over the map. Schlechter tells him, forget it, no one knows where he is, and he's got no leverage.
Schlechter says that Russo's only hope is if Max is still alive when the other Germans find him. Schlechter picks up his canteen and asks if he can take a drink, and Russo says yes. And then he shoots through the canteen as Schlechter is trying to drink out of it.
Russo then pulls on his own canteen and says, "Tell me, you've been out here a long time. Does it get pretty hot out here?" Then time passes, the day grows hotter, and Schlechter is growing delirious from the heat. A sweaty Schlechter is lying on the ground, and Russo taunts him, asking him if he's lost his gift of gab. Then consulting the minefield map, Schlechter starts throwing rocks, and one of them connects and sets off a mine. Russo tells him he's got 2 canteens of water, and he can have one if he gets Russo out of there. This news appears to revive Schlechter, and the heat exhaustion subsides, and he sets to work to follow the tripwire between the mines. He gets past 3 mines and then tells Russo that the mines are laid in 4s and there is still one between them. So now is the time to throw the water over. But Russo isn't going to fall for that again. They're going to do this his way.
Schlechter starts pulling up the wires that connected the mines. Once there's enough loose, the 2 of them tie their respective items of value to it, using the rifle as a pulley so they can work the wire between them,
sending the water to Schlechter and the map to Russo.
After an excruciating slow wire transfer, Schlechter starts laughing idiotically as Russo asks what's so funny. Schlechter says, "Look at the map." Russo does, and it's 1000% made-up junk.
Schlechter continues laughing as he allows Russo to take him prisoner. So they march off, Schlechter at gunpoint and Russo limping behind him. And Schlechter is laughing all the way.
Now we see the rescue team from Company C, who were present in the beginning of the movie, they're close by. One of them makes a poop joke at his own expense for some reason, and the two others look at a picture of Russo's girl, which he sold to one of them for $5. She's very pretty.
Back with Russo and Schlechter. Russo sits Schlechter down for a break. Once they're on the ground, Schlechter kicks Russo's bad leg and takes the gun and canteen from him. Russo tells him to shoot and get it over with. But Schlechter, while taking a drink from the canteen, says that would be too easy. The desert would be a better way. He starts to leave them there, but...
The cavalry is here. They yell at Schlechter to hold it, but he points his gun at Russo and says they can't just fire on him, or else Russo's dead. They fall back, and Sergeant Collins tells one of his soldiers to go up over the ridge and get behind the German. Then they go to Schlechter with their hands raised.
When they reach Schlechter and Russo, they lean down to give Russo some water. Then the soldier who had snuck behind them shouts out and shoots Schlechter. Schlechter is down, but not out. He repeatedly tries to fire Russo's gun, but is out of ammunition.
Russo laughs hysterically, right into the credits. It's almost over. We see another title card come up that says June 12th, 1943, 1900 hours. All of this happened in a 12-hour span.
And as we go into the closing credits, where the cast is introduced, this information would have been helpful to have seen at the beginning of the movie, even more helpful if it had included the characters' names as well as the actors.
It took us a long time to figure out who's who. But anyway, it's all over. Welcome back, soldiers, to the American International Podcast, where we're talking about Hell Squad from 1958.
Hell Squad was Burt Topper's first film. The film was shot in Indio, California, which was the stand-in for the Tunisian Sahara Desert. The film was produced for only $11,500, which was even less than what it cost to make the astounding she-monster.
Wow. It was shot on 16mm film, which was then blown up to 35mm for general release. However, this doesn't seem to have affected the quality of the film, according to one reviewer. The film was originally titled The Ground They Walk, but was retitled Hell Squad when American International Pictures bought the cinema distribution rights.
Some of the cast got write-ups in the AIP press book, where we learned that Wally Campo was discovered by an American International Pictures executive during a production of Night Must Fall in a summer stock performance. That led to him being cast in Machine Gun Kelly.
Frederick Gavlin, who was Clemens, caught the showbiz bug at age 12. He went to a local theater where he told the director there that he wanted to learn all about show business, so the director gave him a broom and had him sweep the stage. You got to start somewhere.
Brandon Carroll, who played Lieutenant Max Schlechter, is a descendant of Robert E. Lee, played high school football and boxed, and served as a gunner in the U.S. Navy Air Corps for 2.5 years.
And we read in the press book that Hell Squad bears the indelible stamp of one man, Burt Topper, who wrote, produced, and directed. For this, in quotes, his achievement is hailed as one of the outstanding single efforts in recent years, if AIP does say so themselves.
AIP also tooted their own horn in the press book, saying, Hell Squad is reputed to be the most memorable film to date from that new giant of motion picture productions, American International Pictures.
Well, why so modest, AIP? In the write-up for Hell Squad, they warned that the movie was not for the squeamish. When the story calls for the enemy to kill GIs, strip them of their clothes, and leave them to die in the sun, the movie is presented just like that.
Unlike most of AIP's films, even their war movies, there are understandably no female cast members in Hell Squad.
The movie was released in July of 1958 on a double bill with the Korean War film Tank Battalion. The AIP press book recommended theater owners have a special showing for veterans of World War II, which is a great idea, and also to arrange for a radio interview with a veteran of that war as part of the film's promotion. They were also recommended to exhibit war paraphernalia like helmets, rifles, and machine guns in the lobby. I can't imagine a theater doing that with any current release.
The studio also recommended theaters set up a shortwave radio receiver tuned to an army station in the lobby, and a do-it-yourself project involving a map of the Libyan desert, apparently forgetting that the movie was set in Tunisia, with explosions drawn on it. Each doodle should have a colored ribbon leading from the explosion to a still from the movie.
Taglines for the movie include, "Hits like steel, the guts and gore of desert war.
Raging inferno of war.
A motion picture you'll never forget."
Director Burt Topper was a former actor who got tired of being in front of the camera and decided to make his own movie. Sam Arkoff said in his autobiography that Burt could do just about anything behind the scenes. Take a camera apart, build a camera mount, and produce, write, and direct a picture like Hell Squad. Arkoff was impressed at how little Topper spent making this movie.
He would be. In 1958, AIP announced that Topper would make a series of films for them, including Tank Destroyers, Last Woman on Earth, Young Warrior, and Yacht Party. You recognize any of those titles, Jeff?
I recognize one title, and it's a Corman picture, so I don't know if Burt Topper was involved with that or not.
Now, obviously they weren't produced, but Topper would be associated with AIP for the rest of his career.
Topper was one of the first independent producer-directors to make films for AIP. All in all, he made a dozen films for AIP, including Diary of a High School Bride, Thunder Alley, and The Devil's Eight.
By the mid-60s, Topper was acting as an in-house producer, director, writer for American International Pictures. He also narrated a couple of AIP's Mondo films. But he left employment with them in 1969 to re-enter independent production, but he still maintained strong links with AIP.
There aren't many contemporary reviews of Hell Squad available to us, but we did find a short and sweet one from Variety that read, "Somewhat novel plot, but too much footage is wasted leading up to it."
This is very early on in the AIP canon, so a lot of these actors would appear in future projects. Wally Campo, Private Russo, appeared in Machine Gun Kelly, as we mentioned. He also went on to be in Tank Commandos in 1958, The Little Shop of Horrors in 1960, Master of the World 1961, Tales of Terror 1963, and Devil's Angels in 1967.
Frank Gavlin as Sergeant Clemens and Jack P. Sowards as German soldier in American uniform would both appear in Tank Commandos in 1958. And also of interest is that Jack B. Sowards would go on to write the screenplay for Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan.
Oh, wow. Not an AIP production, though. Larry Shuttleworth as Sergeant Collins was also in Tank Commandos and Diary of a High School Bride in 1959.
And as we mentioned, writer, director, producer Burt Topper did several projects for AIP, including Tank Commandos as writer, director, producer, and The Diary of a High School Bride as writer, director, producer. He was also the producer of Space Probe Taurus in 1965, Fireball 500 in 1966, Thunder Alley in 1967, and Devil's Angels, also in 1967.
He also produced Teenage Rebellion, aka Mondo Teen, for Transamerican in 1967. He was executive producer for Wild in the Streets in 1968. We did an episode on that. He was writer, director, producer for The Devil's Eight in 1969, The Hard Ride, also in 1969, and the co-producer of Chomps, CHOMPS, in 1979. All right, Jeff, we've been through this movie, described it, everyone else's thoughts on it. We know what AIP thought of this movie from their press book. But Jeff, what are your thoughts? Using our scale of AIP, where A is awesome, I is intermediate, and P is pathetic.
Well, I do have a lot of thoughts about this movie, and I've tried to organize them as best as I could. Hell Squad really surprised me. I'll admit that going into it, my expectations were low. I wasn't really expecting to enjoy a low-budget movie about war times. I figured it would be easy to exploit the violence of war over plot and characterization. And I knew the movie would have to present a situation strong enough to get me to care. But I wasn't without hope. I just figured that it would be a long shot and Hell Squad would turn out to be okay at best. But that's what Hell Squad was able to do in their telling of a story taking place over the course of 12 hours. Of the 5 main characters in Hell Squad, Sergeant Clemens and Privates Lippy, Roth, Nelson, and Russo, we learned the most about Lippy's backstory. But then he's the first to succumb to enemy fire, not including Private Slade, who buys it at the beginning of the film. Private Slade, we hardly knew you. Lippy's death is all the more tragic because of what we learned about him. His 2 brothers were previously killed in battle, and Lippy was set to return home soon, presumably to carry on the family name or possibly because of mental distress. The other characters have their distinguishing characteristics. Private Roth is the not-too-bright one. Nelson is the innocent youngster, not really the military type. Sergeant Clemens was probably given the least characterization of any of them. He's just trying to keep his men alive. Then there's the smart-mouthed, cigar-chomping Russo. He's the character that is fun to watch on screen, but a person you dread having to spend any time with in real life. And it's interesting to see Wally Campo play this character because we've previously only seen him as Maze, the mousy getaway driver who doesn't manage to get away early on in the movie Machine Gun Kelly. And this, which was apparently his only leading role, feels like a tour de force for him. When I learned that this was an independent-produced, very low-budget film, I just figured that would be another strike against my enjoyment of it. I really should know better. Successful indie films are dependent on story, usually more than exploitation, more than anything else. And this one was very well done. There are some interesting camera angles and a lot of close-ups. I found myself comparing it to The Astounding She-Monster because of the similar low budgets. She-Monster had a slightly larger budget, fewer camera setups, and a comparatively ridiculous script, and I dare say less competent performers. Hell Squad beats the She-Monster on all fronts. When the movie started, that opening sequence didn't instill much hope for me. It's just too dark to see what's going on. In retrospect, I think it may be the capture of Treacher that is referred to throughout the film, but it's really impossible to tell. And there are a few unintended laughs in the movie. Though we're told the action is taking place in Tunisia, it looks a lot like the California desert and not at all like the Tunisia I've seen in pictures. And the scene where the Hell Squad is crawling past the Germans to sneak up on them from behind is also unintentionally hilarious. But it is a well-known fact that Germans have no peripheral vision. In fact, even Steven Spielberg exploited this fact in Raiders of the Lost Ark when the Germans failed to notice Indian Solace contractors digging for the Well of Souls nearby their own dig. Of course I'm joking, but I do find it amusing that the two films made nearly a quarter of a century apart would use the same technique to advance their plots. Actually, the Germans are pretty nefarious here. They keep getting the jump on our heroes by playing themselves off as allies. But then again, our heroes keep falling for it. And that's what brings us to the film's climax, with Russo sitting in a minefield and having to match wits against Max Schlechter. I really did enjoy this movie. I think that owes in part to its brisk running time. At 65 minutes, there isn't much time for filler. Burt Topper's script isn't packed to the hilt with dialogue to fill time like some of the shorter films we've watched for this podcast. I'm looking at you, Chuck Griffith. In fact, there are several minutes of people just walking around and looking very, very warm. And that was actually a nice relief. Some of those talking movies can be exhausting, no matter how great they may be. But Hell Squad is still right up there with them, and I'm giving this one an awesome rating of A. What are your thoughts, Cheryl?
Hell Squad is the second war movie we've done for this podcast, if we include Operation Bikini, and I suppose we must. I really wasn't looking forward to watching either film because I've never really enjoyed movies about the wars, unless they're about civilians living through the wars, like movies about ordinary British people trying to get on with life during the World War II Blitz. But movies about combat, battles, underwater destruction teams, and the like, it's just not for me, no matter how competently they're made. So that was the attitude I took into the viewing of this movie. That said, I won't let it color my rating for the film. Hell Squad was made by a first-time director on a shoestring budget over a limited amount of time. And just like you, I found that it was more comparable to The Astounding She-Monster than any AIP war epic. And Hell Squad is leagues ahead of Astounding She-Monster, which was released less than a year earlier, in just about any metric you can look at. Astounding She-Monster suffered from its low budget, but even though Burt Topper had less money to work with than Ronnie Ashcroft did, his film doesn't look laughably underfunded. There were no wardrobe malfunctions that they couldn't afford to fix. Topper didn't pad the film out with repetitive sequences. And so even though both films are around the same length, just over an hour, Hell Squad has much more story packed into his short running time. And like you said, Hell Squad has the much better script. Topper manages to create a lot of tension and suspense for a film that at its core is about a few soldiers lost in the desert. When the squad comes across the bodies of the dead American GIs, seeing that they've been stripped of their uniforms, they know that somewhere German soldiers are pretending to be American, and that could be deadly. And then they realize that one of their own men in the squad wandered off without knowing that. I found that tension to be very effective. And the scene at the end when Russo and Schlechter are negotiating in bad faith for that minefield map and the canteen of water was very well done. I didn't know how it was going to play out. It was not predictable at all. So many American soldiers had died by that point that I would not have been surprised if Russo got killed then too. And this movie is just the right length. There wasn't any more to add to the story, so if the studio had insisted that Topper make it an hour and 20-minute long movie, I have no doubt that he would have been tempted to film a lot more shots of the men trudging through the desert, and that would make the movie really drag. Although they could have maybe shown more of what happened at the beginning of the movie, the explosion that sends the soldiers running off and getting separated. What we saw happens under the opening credits, and it's really dark, like we said. It took a while to get the sense of what caused the men to run and then get separated. And I think I only figured it out because we were watching it in very short sequences as we took in everything that happened. And we never found out what happened to the Lieutenant Treacher. They maybe could have included some of that information. We noticed right away that this is not the Sahara Desert. And it did take me out of the movie a little bit to see that the setting was so wrong for where they were supposed to be. I know they didn't have Star Wars money, but I would hope that if they are trying to simulate the Sahara Desert, they could find a place in California where it's really sandy and not so scrubby. This setting looked more like rural Arizona, where we live, than it did Tunisia. And of course, it was shot in India, so that's no surprise. I think that the characters were really, really hard to tell apart at first, too. If I had to watch this in the theater at the time of its release, I'm not sure I would have ever been able to figure out who they all were. I had the benefit of the Internet Movie Database to consult and the ability to watch those end credits where they give the names of the actors and their faces before the movie started. And then we rewound it and started watching from the beginning. But I don't think those are really major quibbles. So like you, I'm going to give this movie the rank of A for awesome. Despite its limitations in terms of budgets and time, it turned out surprisingly good.
Comparing again to The Astounding She-Monster, that was one where they had a similar runtime, and it had lots of scenes of people walking to fill out the time.
There were people walking over the same ground. One person walked away and got lost, and the other person followed him, and we saw several minutes of this. And then the monster was wandering through the woods, and she would walk the same path. They were just reusing shots at that point. That movie should have been about 38 minutes long. So obviously Hell Squad is the better of the two indie movies of that era.
Obviously.
Well, I think that's all we have for this episode. So before we play taps, I'll say I'm Cheryl Lightfoot.
And I'm Jeff Markin.
And we'll meet you at the drive-in.
Follow the American International Podcast on Instagram and Letterboxd at AIP_pod and on Facebook at facebook.com/American International Podcast.
The American International Podcast is produced and edited by Jeff Markin.
A man whose mind is distorted by hatred.
And Cheryl Lightfoot.
A girl hungry for too many things.
The American International Podcast is part of the Pop Culture Entertainment Network.